Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one we'll discuss the severe weather potential coming up early next week over the Gulf Coast on Monday and over much of the southeastern states on Tuesday. I'll talk about the background environment and the current state of the atmosphere and then go into the models and see how things may play out and what to be watching for. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe and we're going to get started. So I'll begin with the SPC side of things, and these are the outlooks that are recently issued this morning. The severe weather threat is going to start on Monday, and this is the day 4 severe weather outlook that was issued this morning. And this is a pretty large 15% that's outlooked from about southeast Texas all the way up through the central Gulf Coast, including places like Houston, New Orleans, Mobile, and almost all the way up to Tallahassee, Florida, into the pre-dawn hours Tuesday morning. And then we look at the day 5 outlook, and this is another 15% that was issued this morning, and that includes most of the state of Florida, most of southern Georgia, and up into the Carolinas. So this includes places like Tallahassee, Jacksonville, Orlando, and then up into Columbus, Georgia, including places like Charleston and Wilmington, south in North Carolina. So we have a strong storm system that's going to be tracking through the southern U.S., and that's going to cause the severe weather threat early next week. So I'm going to scroll down here to the discussion that is typed out for this outlook. And so the SPC is noting here that in the wake of a cold front that's going to be pushing through this weekend across the Gulf Coast, and that's going to intrude cold, dry air down into the Gulf of Mexico. And so that's going to contribute to the slowing down of the inland moisture return and destabilization across the Gulf Coast for Monday's threat. So the severe weather threat on Monday is sort of limited, mostly to the Gulf Coast areas, and we're going to talk about that when we go into the models here. But I think the greatest severe weather threat is going to be on Tuesday, actually, across mainly Florida and southern Georgia here. And then we'll talk about in the models when we talk about the models here and talk about why that might be. But I think we're going to get stronger. Inland moisture return for Tuesday across Florida and southern Georgia, and so I would have a little bit greater concern for a significant severe weather threat coming up on Tuesday here. So now let's go into the current state of the atmosphere, and here is the current water vapor imagery with the 500 millibar pattern overlaid. So currently we have a strong upper air disturbance here across the southern plains, pretty tightly wound up 500 millibar trough too. But this is not going to be the storm system that we're talking about for next week. This is another one here for this weekend that's going to be pushing through the southern U.S. and into the southeastern states. And so that's going to bring a cold front down into the Gulf of Mexico and bring down the continental polar air mass all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. So the Gulf is going to be swept for this upcoming storm system. So that's going to limit the moisture return that's coming up for at least for Monday's threat. So I will mention with this storm system here, there is going to be a little bit of moisture return and inland destabilization for the immediate Gulf Coast, and so there is a marginal threat of severe storms for tonight and into tomorrow. Here is the severe weather outlook for tomorrow. This is just a marginal risk of severe weather, basically for the same areas that are under the gun for this upcoming week, but mostly a damaging wind threat and maybe a brief tornado or two into the overnight hours tonight. So that is the satellite imagery. Now let's go into our upper air charts, and we're going to start here at 300 millibars, and we are looking for the jet stream. So the jet stream is currently located over basically the western and southern United States here, coming up into the lower Mississippi Valley. And this is an active weather pattern that we're going to be in for the next several days. We're going to have multiple storm systems that are tracking through the southern United States over the next several days. So let's go down here to our 500 millibar pattern. As we saw earlier, we have a pretty strong upper air disturbance here over the southern plains, and we have a pretty tightly wound up trough too. And our trough axis here is kind of a negatively tilted trough down here, with the trough axis leaning back to the left and oriented from northwest to southeast. So a pretty strong storm system here that we're looking at. Let's go down here to 850 millibars, and we are looking for the low-level jet here. So we have a low-level jet of about 30 to 40 knots or so across Louisiana and the Gulf Coast. So pretty nice low-level jet here, and that is responsible for transporting that warm, moist air mass from the Gulf of Mexico up into the United States. So pretty strong warm air advection that's ongoing here across the southern U.S. That is in the red shading here that you see on your screen. So that is bringing up warmer air from the Gulf and to help provide the fuel for thunderstorms. So let's go down here to the surface here, and we have a couple of different surface lows that we're looking at. We have one here that is over the Texas and Oklahoma vicinity, and then one down here over the Gulf Coast. So these lows are going to be tracking off to the northeast here, and we have a pretty strong high pressure system that is over the Carolinas. And so that's going to keep the air mass here across the southeastern states pretty cool and stable for this weekend. And that's going to be limiting here the potential for severe weather and that inland moisture return. So really just looking at the Gulf Coast here for any severe weather potential. So these are the surface dew points that are analyzed here in the shading, blue and green shading that you see here. So this shows our 60-degree dew points here in the green shading. Here are pretty much kept from the United States and pretty much going to stay mostly offshore, maybe come up a little bit onshore here across Louisiana and pretty much hugging the Gulf Coast by this evening. And so when we get this cold front that's going to push into the Gulf of Mexico, that's going to sweep the 60-degree dew points back down into the Gulf. And that's just showing that inland moisture return is going to be hard to come by with both of these storm systems that are coming up. So now that I covered the observations, let's dive into the models, and we're going to compare the models among the GFS, the European, and the NAM, as this event is still a few days out. So the models are mostly good agreement for this upcoming severe weather threat, but there could be still some minor differences, so we're going to take a look at those. So this is the current run of the GFS, the 06E run, and so it's initializing the weather pattern pretty nicely here. So this is kind of what we have currently going on. We've got this tightly wound up trough here, kind of taking on that negative tilt here across the southern plains. And so it's initializing things here pretty well. So let's go forward here to next week. So this trough moves on out of here on Saturday across the southeastern states. And then by Sunday, we get this next big upper level trough here that digs down into the desert southwest on Sunday. And then by Monday morning, it's going to be, or excuse me, well, maybe more about Monday afternoon, Monday evening, it's going to be ejecting out into the southern plains. So this is 6 a.m. Monday morning. And so we have a pretty strong upper level trough here that's digging down here into the desert southwest. And that's going to be pushing on to the east here by Monday afternoon, and by Monday evening it's ejecting out into the southern plains here, and then moving on into the lower Mississippi Valley by Tuesday morning. So, and this is taking on a pretty stout looking trough here. We got a very tightly wound up trough that you see here that's modeled on the GFS, and it's taking initially kind of more of a positively tilted trough, but then you get some stronger winds that round at the base of that trough, and then it takes on more of a neutral tilt by Tuesday morning. So we're going to cover Monday's severe weather threat first, and then we'll go on into Tuesday here. So we can look up here at 250 millibars here, and we can look at the diffluence, or the upper level divergence, up here in the upper atmosphere. But upper level divergence, I talk about it on most videos, but it's the spreading apart of those wind vectors in the upper parts of the atmosphere. And so that's going to create a void in the atmosphere. So the atmosphere is going to fill that void by bringing air up from below that level to fill that void. And so that's the synoptic scale rising motion. That is the upper level support for severe thunderstorms. So we can look at that here at 250 millibars. We can either use 250 or 300 millibars, depends on which website that you're looking at, but it's basically the same thing here. So across the lower Mississippi Valley and up through the Midwestern states, you have winds that are coming up out of the south, and then you have over the Gulf of Mexico, you have winds out of the west-southwest. So that's creating strong upper-level divergence here across the deep south and the Gulf Coast. And so you're going to have strong upper-level support here across the Gulf Coast for severe weather. Okay, now we can go down into the lower levels here and look at our mass response here. So I'm going to start here at around 12Z. So this is 6 a.m. Monday morning. We have a pretty decent low-level jet already, about 40 to 50 knots or so across the southern plains, and that is only going to strengthen as we go through the day on Monday. Up here across the lower Mississippi Valley in the deep south, by midnight Tuesday morning, we have a pretty stout low-level jet here, about 60 to 70 knots or so out of the south here. That's going to be really efficiently transporting that warm air advection, or that warm air from the Gulf, and that's really going to increase that moisture return inland here. So the low-level jet, as we know, plays two critical roles. So it is responsible for that warm air advection and also increasing that low-level wind shear that is favorable for tornadoes. So now let's go down here to the surface pattern. Here, so by Monday morning, we have our surface low that is centered over the Texas Panhandle, with a cold front that is stretching down here across western Texas, and the warm front is going to be situated over central Texas down into the Gulf of Mexico here. That's going to be the main limiting factor for Monday's severe weather threat. Your warm front here is going to be slow to come back up to the north due to the precipitation that's going to be ongoing here Monday across the Gulf Coast. And so what can happen is you get showers that form along the warm front, and that reinforces that warm front down to the south. So that's going to limit the northward return of the moisture. So let's go forward here through the day on Monday. And okay, so this is Monday afternoon. So let's take a look at what our surface is forecasted to look like here on the GFS. So this is our surface low over western Oklahoma, with our cold front that is stretching down across Texas here. And then our warm front is going to be located somewhere over southeast Texas and down into the Louisiana Gulf Coast. So it's slowly lifting back to the north here. And so the severe weather threat, if any, does develop, it's going to be Monday night across Louisiana and maybe the Mississippi Gulf Coast. But across southeast Texas, the severe weather threat could begin as early as Monday afternoon. And so let's look at the moisture return here across southeast Texas. So the moisture return across southeast Texas is looking pretty good. We have our 60s dew points coming up here to southeast Texas and kind of hugging that Gulf Coast line across Louisiana. And then that comes up here across Louisiana and southern Mississippi by Monday night. I do cast some doubt on the northward return of moisture on the GFS model. It might be overestimating that a little bit, and usually in these types of scenarios, the models tend to be a little bit too aggressive on the moisture return due to the amount of precipitation that's ongoing north of the warm front, and as we talked about before, that can reinforce that warm front down to the south, so that can really slow that moisture return inland. The GFS model is the more aggressive model when it comes to moisture return for this setup. So let's look at the European model and compare that with what we have for the GFS. So the European does not, this website does not have dew points for the European model, so we can look at I can look at Pivotal for this one. But we can at least get an idea of our surface pattern here. So our surface low is in a pretty similar spot over the Texas Panhandle. And your cold front is stretching down here over across West Texas. And our warm front is kind of over here across central Texas, maybe probably down into the Gulf Coast. So it's pretty far down south into the Gulf of Mexico. And so let's see how that progresses as we go through the afternoon. Let's see, this is about 3 p.m. Monday afternoon. So our surface low is up here in northern Oklahoma. So I think that it's a little bit further north than what the GFS had. And our warm front is going to be down here, kind of hugging that Gulf Coast line. So yeah, the European model is a little bit further south with your warm front here. And I think it's being a little bit more realistic on the inland moisture return here. So we can't see the dew points, but as we know, the dew points can't exceed what the temperature is. So we have upper 50s here across the lower Mississippi Valley in the deep south, kind of in the Gulf Coast, just barely getting into the low 60s. So our 60 degrees dew points are going to be hugging that Gulf Coast line Monday night into early Tuesday morning. So it's not as robust with the moisture return, and I think that might be a little bit more realistic. So the severe weather threat for the central Gulf Coast, like Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama Gulf Coast, I think is a more conditional threat. It's conditional upon if we can get enough moisture return into that region. We do have a really strong tightening of that surface low. Here is the surface low center that is kind of in northeast Arkansas and western Tennessee. The cold front stretching down here across the central Gulf Coast. And our warm front would be kind of somewhere in southern Mississippi down into southern Alabama and the Florida Gulf Coast. So now we can go to the NAM here, and we can pull some soundings here and take a look and see what kind of things we need to be looking for as we go into Monday. So let's zoom in here. We can go to the Southern Great Plains sector. Let's get to the most recent run. Okay, so this is the 12Z run of the NAM. So let's go forward here to the afternoon. So this is right around lunchtime here. And let's get a sounding here in southeast Texas. Let's try and get one here around the Houston area. And so this is just getting this kind of a sample of what is going on in the atmosphere at the time. So since this is still pretty far out, I'm not going to go into the specifics here on the parameters here. That parameter spacing is going to change as we get closer to the event. But let's take a look here at the SPC and the photograph here. And we can get a pretty good idea of what severe weather threat we could be looking at for southeast Texas Monday afternoon. So the SPC here, let's take a look at the moist layer here. So the moist layer extends up to about 700 millibars, so a very deep moist layer that extends up into the atmosphere. And then we have pretty steep lapse rates aloft here. So that we're going to be able to destabilize the atmosphere here across southeast Texas. That is also going to be dependent on any cloud cover. So cloud cover is probably going to be an issue for Monday's severe weather threat, as that could also limit the northward return of moisture. So that is one reason why I'm also not really going into the specifics here on the parameters, because things like cloud cover or limited moisture return could decrease the amount of instability that we have. But so let's say if what we have here verifies. This is a pretty favorable sounding for severe weather, particularly for tornadoes. So we have sufficient instability here. The temperature difference between our parcel temperature and the environmental temperature, which is the red line that is modeled here. And so what I've sketched in here is the amount of instability that is in the atmosphere. So this is a pretty unstable environment. And we have pretty strong varying of the winds with altitude as well. So that is going to create large clockwise curving hodographs here. So we have strong deep layer shear and strong low level wind shear as well. So for storms, any storms that can develop in southeast Texas, what will probably be a squall line will have the potential for damaging straight line winds and an embedded tornado threat. And I also could not rule out a strong tornado threat if we get sufficient destabilization, especially down there at the surface. The NAM, as we know, does have kind of a cool bias with our surface temperatures. So say if we get our temperatures up into the low 70s, I think the NAM right here on this sounding has a surface temperature of about 70 degrees. So we can get our temperatures up into, say, the low 70s, which I think is possibly doable. here, we could definitely get enough destabilization for a tornado threat. And I couldn't rule out a strong tornado threat as well, but that could also be dependent on storm mode as well. So that's going to cover it for Monday's threat. Now let's move on to the severe weather threat expected on Tuesday. So this is the GFS. We're switching back to the GFS now and looking at 250 millibars. So we have a really potent branch of the jet stream that is dipping down across the central United States and up into the Midwestern states. And also we have a second branch of the jet that is running across the Gulf of Mexico and into Florida. So we have really strong difluence or upper level divergence across much of the southeast and the southeast U.S. coast. So that's going to bring air up from below, and it's going to create this synoptic scale lift for severe thunderstorms across the region on Tuesday. So as we go forward here, the jet stream is going to push over into the southeastern coast during the afternoon hours on Tuesday and then into the early evening hours. So let's go down here to 500 millibars. And we have a really tightly wound up upper level trough here for Tuesday. That the trough axis is forecasted to be positioned over the lower Mississippi Valley, taking on that negative tilt. And so this is an extremely strong belt of flow that is rounding the base of this trough here. And so this indicates that we have a mature and strong storm system that's going to be tracking through the region. And so by mid to late afternoon, that trough moves out across the southeastern states and then up into the mid-Atlantic region by Tuesday night. So with this system like this, you would expect a pretty strong mass response, and that is what we have continuing into the day on Tuesday. We maintain about a 60 to 70 knot low-level jet throughout the day on Tuesday across southeastern states. You see here in the shading in the reds and purples here, that is about 60 to 70 knots of flow out of the south. So that is really, really potent low-level jet that is pumping up that warm and moist advection from the Gulf of Mexico. And also going to be critical for the strong low-level wind shear that is favorable for tornadoes. So going down here to the surface, our surface low is positioned across the about southeast Missouri vicinity, and then our cold front is stretching down into Alabama and down into the central Gulf of Mexico, with our warm front kind of positioned right along the southeast U.S. coast. And so that's going to be positioned across the southeastern states for pretty much most of the day on Tuesday. So that surface low is going to be tracking up to the north here across the Ohio Valley, and that's going to be dragging a cold front down into the eastern Gulf Coast, the eastern Gulf of Mexico, and down into Florida. So with the moisture, let's take a look at that. So our dew points here, starting at 6 a.m. Tuesday morning, our 60s dew points are forecast to be positioned across much of the southeastern states, so across parts of southern Alabama, southern Georgia, and then down into up into South Carolina. Here, that's going to be advecting for the north here across the Mid-Atlantic region pretty efficiently. And we have mid to upper 60 dew points coming up into northern Florida and southern Georgia. And so that's one thing that I kind of checks my box here. We're getting our dew points into the mid to upper 60s. That's typically where we see more robust instability. So that is one thing that I'm watching out for a significant severe weather threat across parts of northern Florida and southern Georgia. And so with the cold front pushing to the east, that's going to push our moisture into the Carolinas, and then the warm sector kind of gets pinched off here in the mid-Atlantic region, and that kind of brings an end to the severe weather threat by Tuesday evening. So that's the GFS. Let's take a look at the European model and see if we can compare it with the GFS. And so the European model here is actually kind of slower with this storm system here. You can see here the jet stream is a little bit further back to the west across the central United States here, but it's still a very powerful branch of the jet stream. with strong diffluence or upper level divergence across the southeastern states. So pretty similar to what the GFS was showing, just a little bit slower. And actually, this may be a more may actually provide a little bit more of a robust threat of severe weather across the southeastern states, because we're going to see here that the features here are pretty much perfectly timed with peak heating across southern Georgia and northern Florida. By late afternoon Tuesday, the jet stream here impinges onto the jet stream kind of impinges on the region here. Pretty much perfectly timed with peak heating. I mean, that is a pretty gnarly look for the jet stream here for the southeastern states. So let's go down here to 500 millibars, and that is a really strong upper level trough. That's going to be positioned over the southeastern states. This is at around lunchtime Tuesday, and so we have a really strong upper level trough here that's going to take on that negative tilt here across the southeastern states, pretty much between 3 and 6 p.m. on Tuesday. And so that is a pretty robust signal for a significant severe weather threat for Tuesday, for particularly across northern Florida and southern Georgia. And so this is why the SPC is also mentioning the potential for a few strong tornadoes across this region in their convective outlook. So we'll take a look at that and see what the environment is going to look like here in just a moment. Let's take a look at the low-level jet here. We still maintain about 60 to 70 knots or so across northern Florida and southern Georgia and into the mid-Atlantic region on Tuesday afternoon. So low-level shear is still going to remain very strong for this region. The surface low, let's take a look at that. So our surface low is actually a little bit further south than what the GFS had. Our surface low is positioned up here in eastern Arkansas and West Tennessee. Our cold front still down here over the central Gulf of Mexico. Our warm front is positioned somewhere in southern Alabama, southern Georgia, and up into the southeast U.S. coast. And so that is going to lift up to the north here by Tuesday afternoon. This is around lunchtime Tuesday. So our surface low is moved up into the Ohio Valley and southern Illinois. And then a cold front is pushing to the east here across Alabama and into Georgia and through the Florida Panhandle. Warm front is positioned somewhere up in southern Georgia and into the Carolinas. And so this is also going to set up a triple point here. I talked about it in one of my previous videos, but that triple point is where you have three different air masses coming together. So we have our maritime tropical air mass down to the south of that warm front. In the north of that warm front, we have your maritime polar air mass. And then behind the cold front here, we have our continental polar air mass. So where you have those three air masses coming together, that is where our triple point is located. And that can be a favored location for tornadoes. So I would not be surprised if we have a few strong tornadoes kind of up in northern Florida and into southern Georgia. This position could easily shift in the models coming up. We're still about 4 or 5 days away, but this is a pretty robust signal for a significant threat of severe weather. And so let's actually take a look at the dew points here off the European model for Tuesday afternoon. So I'm going to switch over to Pivotal Weather here. So switching to a different website. So this is where our dew points are forecasted to be Tuesday morning. We have low 60 dew points kind of hugging that Gulf Coast corridor. And then those are going to surge to the north here pretty efficiently across southern Georgia and into the Carolinas. We have mid 60 dew points pretty much widespread and even up into the upper 60s down in central Florida. So where you get those dew points up in 65, 66, or 67 range, that's going to be a pretty moist and unstable environment for severe weather. And then as we go into the afternoon hours and into the early evening, those 60s dew points continue to advect northward up into the Carolinas. And then our cold front pushes in from the west, and so that's going to bring an end to the severe weather threat. Okay, so now I'm going to switch back to the GFS model, and let's take a couple of soundings here. I get a sounding here from about southwest of Tallahassee. Let's see what the environment is going to look like. And this is just based off the GFS, so this may not be fully representative of what the environment is going to be like. This is just, we're just going to take a look at the SPC here and the hodograph. So on the SPC here, lapse rates aren't all that steep. Your temperature change is not all that rapid. Our lapse rates here are pretty meager. So that's going to lead to a little bit more skinny instability here. So the distance here between your partial temperature and your environmental temperature is pretty skinny. So marginal instability, but take a look at that hodograph. I mean, my word. That is, look at the variant of the winds with altitude is really strong with that, and a very rapid increase of wind speed as you go up in the altitude. So that's going to make some really large, long and elongated and very large clockwise curvature in our hodograph here. So that's going to be extremely favorable for a damaging wind threat and also an embedded tornado threat as well. I suspect at this point most of the storms will probably be in a squall line. They're going to be pretty strongly forced along that cold front. So the storm mode is going to be mostly a squall line with a primarily threat of damaging winds and an embedded tornado threat. It could not rule out a significant tornado threat given the strength of this hodograph here, but that's going to be strongly dependent on the destabilization. You would probably need a little bit stronger instability for a significant tornado threat, but again, this is just the GFS model, and this is about 4 or 5 days out, so I'm not going to really take. I'm going to take what is showing here with a big grain of salt here, but this is a really strong low-level wind shear that would most definitely give you at least an embedded tornado threat. So let's go a little bit further out here to Tuesday afternoon. So the GFS is pushing the cold front here pretty quickly. I'm not quite so sure about that. I think this lower European model might have a little bit better handle on the timing, but let's take a sounding here across central Florida here. So let's see what that's going to show. Okay, so the instability is a little bit stronger. Have a little bit stronger instability. Still pretty decent veering of the winds with altitude, so it's going to create elongated and pretty large curvature in our hodograph. So still a pretty favorable environment for severe weather, particularly for damaging winds and a tornado threat. If there are any discrete supercells in this environment, those could have the potential for a significant tornado threat. But let's take a look at the European model here. Let's try and get a sounding here off the European model. I'm going to go back here to around lunchtime. So yeah, this is where the cold front is forecasted on the GFS. Here, I'll draw that in real quick. So cold front is kind of somewhere in this vicinity here, so it's already pushing off into the Carolinas and then pushing into central Florida here. But on the European model, the cold front is all the way back out, still kind of out here in Alabama. Let me put that in a different color. Kind of already, it's still back here in Alabama, down into the central Gulf of Mexico. So it is much slower with our storm system here on the European model. So this would provide a more robust threat of severe weather. Let's try and get a sounding here. Where is that? So let's get a sounding here from Tallahassee, Florida. Here from the European model. So instability is pretty limited, but again, this is on the European model, so about 5 days in advance. So this is not going to accurately forecast the amount of instability. So, but I mean, just take a look at that hodograph. That is pretty remarkable looking hodograph here with lots of curvature in that lowest levels and very strong deep layer shear. for a severe weather threat. Let's take a look further down to the south here. This is around Gainesville, Florida, and this is going to show a little bit more instability. Dew points getting up into the mid 60s, and temperatures warming up into the mid 70s. So that's pretty good for instability, and still a pretty decent looking photograph here. And that's what you want to see for a damaging wind and tornado threat. So let's go forward here a few more hours and see if we can get a really good sounding here. It's going to be one northwest kind of. Let's get a sounding here from about southeast Georgia, kind of where that triple point is going to set up here. And I mean, just look at that photograph. That is pretty remarkable up here where that triple point is. That's why the triple point is usually a more favored location for tornadoes. You get a much stronger low-level wind shear and a much stronger surface convergence, and so that usually provides a greater tornado threat. Instability, we'll have to see if we can get some instability up in that builds up into the triple point. But if so, this is going to be a pretty robust tornado threat that evolves in the southeastern states. So we're just going to have to see how trends look as we head into Tuesday. So the bottom line kind of for this event, for Monday, we're going to at least be looking. So to kind of wrap things up here, we're going to give kind of a bottom line for Monday into Tuesday again. So for the severe weather threat on Monday, the day 4, at least a severe weather threat for southeast Texas, places like Houston and Galveston areas. And so that's going to be at least a threat for damaging winds and a few embedded tornadoes. I suspect the storm load is going to be mostly a squall line, so it's really just going to limit it to a damaging wind and embedded tornado threat. Can't rule out a significant tornado if we can get it kind of a supercell kind of embedded in that squall line. But I think the severe weather threat is probably more conditional out in Louisiana, Mississippi, and into Alabama Monday night. It's going to be dependent on that moisture return, if we can get those 60s dew points up far enough to the north. But then as we go into Tuesday, I think that could bring a more significant threat of severe weather, for particularly across northern Florida and southern Georgia, kind of where that triple point may set up. And so that can give a more significant tornado threat if we can get enough instability up in that region. And so as we get closer, we get into more short range model guidance. Those can a little bit more accurately depict the instability. So we'll have to wait and see what trends look like as we go through the next few days. So that's all that I have for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.